So this summer I wanted to do something a little different with you, and I am inviting you in to come join a totally different kind of knit along with me this summer. Anybody who's been following me for a few years, or maybe if you've actually kind of jumped in and looked back through my back catalogue, you may notice something called a stash dive knit along. That was back in the summer of 2020. I wanted to use up my stash. Just like everyone else, I was at home, wasn't able to get out, and I wanted to do something where I was able to share it with all of you and have something that we kind of worked on together and invite you a little bit into my design world or experimenting yourself and playing around a little bit with knitting. So this was what came of that. It was me taking a whole series of fingering weight yarns, a couple of mohair fluffs, ones where the colors didn't match, but they actually all look nice together. So it went from this lovely mustardy lemon, yellow, into blues and purples, into a very dark grey, and they were a mix of companies, mix of fibres, and yeah, we had the orange mohair and a grey mohair, and they didn't go exactly together, but when you put them together they felt like they could potentially form some kind of a cohesive whole. So this is where Stash Dive Knit Along came along. And you may notice me holding up a few little bits of yarn in my hand here, different colours. They do look like they match together, but I wanted to knit something for myself this summer. I didn't want to spend too long designing it because I wanted to be very simple. And my mind kind of went back to the Stash Dive Knit Along and to the possibility of a variation on it. And maybe you might like to revisit it with me as well. So the entirety of the first one is all still there. There's no gauge. It's just a very bare bones idea of how I put it together, but explaining how I calculate items or stuff, shapes all the way along the way. So I'm going to get started again, but with linen this time. Again, top down, probably going to go for something short sleeves or almost no sleeves. So it's really more like I suppose not quite a cover up, but just a very, very lightweight over layer. So I wanted to be knit a little bit more loosely. And I'm going to be able to change two things with this. The first thing is, when I knit this, it ended up being a lot bigger than I expected because the gauge grew considerably when I was knitting it, and that worked out fine. The only place it really had an impact was the neck. The neck was too open, so I actually ended up picking up stitches all the way around the edge here. This one here, ideally, I'd like to leave a kind of a raw open neck on the linen. So I want to make it narrower. So I'm going to measure the width of this and then take it in just even a little bit further. I've done a couple of different swatches on my gauge, which we can jump in with, and I'll show you how I go ahead and pick the gauge, how I knit through this, and you can use this kind of as a companion knit, really, I suppose you could say, to the Stash Dive Knit Along, where I'll go into more detail about the numbers on each section. But this is just me going through and knitting it for myself. It's a top-down sweater. You start across the back with the top section, and then you're just going to do short rows across the top part and then knit straight down, come back, pick up stitches at the front and shape the front of the neck. So all I'm going to do today is pick my yarn, pick my size, measure my gauge and figure out my stitches, and we get started with the short row and the back of it next week. So that's where we're going today. So if you've got something you'd like to knit quickly and actually get something done that you can use for the end of the summer, then I invite you to join me in this brand new Stash Dive Summer Knit Along. I have all of my tools and everything I need set up now so that I can determine what needle size I need and what gauge I get, and then therefore how many stitches I'm going to need. So the first thing I've done is I picked out my yarn, and if you're doing a Stash Dive Knit Along, you get to pick your own yarn. You're not matching any gauge, and it's one of the lovely things about it is your gauge is what feels good to you in terms of the fabric. That's the only thing that's important. So I knit this with the recommended was, I think, 3 to 4 millimeter needles might be it. So I started with 3 millimeter and then I tried 3.75 and then 4. The 3.5 I just felt was a little too tight. 4 was a little loose, so a bit like Goldilocks. I settled somewhere in the middle and I decided to go 0.75 needles here. So then what I did is I just pulled this up 4 inches across here and put markers in each side, and then counted each of these stitches, because obviously each of these sides is 1 stitch. So you kind of want to make sure you're counting along like this. And when I counted along, I was getting 22 stitches over those 4 inches, which will mean that I've got 5.5 stitches for every inch, which is your building block. Your 1 inch building blocks is going to be 5.5. And then I did the same for row gauge. Now it was shorter, so all I was able to calculate here was 2 inches of row gauge. So I'm going to pull this, I'll move this to the side here. So I had 2 inches of row gauge, so that was 14.5. When I multiplied that by 2, it would mean I've got 29 rows for my, that should be for 4 inches, over 4 inches. Divide that by 4 and I get 7.25 rows in every inch. So that is the really important thing I want from a building block point of view. So this is a very, very basic template from the top down. We're going to cast on the width of the body you want here. Because it's a very oversized one, it's going to look a lot bigger than the body size that I'm knitting with. So just keep that in mind, that it's going to look much, much bigger. The neck of the previous one I did was too wide, so I'm going to loosen that down. I'm going to knit from the top down. So I'm going to have to figure out next what the width of this is going to be. So I'm going to pull the camera out a bit so that you get to see the sweater and we can measure the width of the previous sweater. So now I have got this previous sweater. I'm going to open up here. And I quite like the width, maybe a tiny bit narrower, but the neck was much too wide, which is why I ended up kind of filling in this part of the neck here. So I don't want to actually go any wider than this neck width here. But let's take a look to see what the width of my body is here on this one. Again, it's a little bit oversized from what I actually wanted, so I can probably go a little bit smaller. So this is very large. So you see this is 26 inches wide, so I've got a 52-inch chest circumference. I'm more inclined to, I think, have something that is perhaps like around about this wide, something like that. So that's going to give me about 22, that sounds about right. I think about 22 inches wide is correct. So this would be closer to what I'm looking at here. 9 inches or even smaller, so maybe even 8 inches, because I can always because it's going to stretch out a bit because I don't want an edging. So if I make this 8 inches wide and that 22 inches wide, so I can actually then calculate what I need. So if I 22 multiplied by that 1 inch, which is 5.5 stitches, pull my calculator up. So it's 22 by 5.5, and we'll say 120. I'll usually round up or round down. So 120 stitches. And if I set 8 inches here by 5.5, 8 multiplied by 5.5 is going to give me 44 stitches. So then we also want to find out how wide each of these are. So I'm going to take 120 minus 44. It gives me 76 for this and this, but half is going to be on each side. So I'll divide that by 2. So that's going to be 38 stitches on this shoulder and 38 stitches on that shoulder. So this is going to be the width of the neck. And then we have got 38 stitches where we're doing the turn. So if for our 5.5, it's usually when you're making your short row turns here, it's going to be about every 3/4 of an inch. So 3 by 5.5 divide 4, about every 4 stitches. Short row turn. Now the other thing I'm going to take a look at is see what depth did I use for the armhole here. So the armhole depth I had is 7 inches here, and then the rest of my body down here is 9 inches. So I had this was from here 7 inches, and I haven't shown it, and then I'll just put 9 inches body. So these are really rough dimensions, and because you're doing a top down, you can actually kind of adjust it a little as you're going. You might even opt to do, if you want to keep the shoulders a little narrower, you might do a small little bit of increases coming down here. So you can kind of play around with it a little bit. It's just by having something to start with, I know where I'm going and what I want it to look like.